He was 78 years old. He had given everything, his house, his possessions, his entire life built with sweat and tears, to his only son, whom he loved more than his own life. And that son drove him into the middle of a desolate mountain forest, leaving him alone in the freezing winter, then returned to the city to await news of his death. This is the story of a father betrayed to the very end, and how he rose up to reclaim everything. If you're watching this video, please hit like now, subscribe to the channel, and comment the name of the city you're watching in so I know how far my story has come. Now, let's begin. The cabin smelled like rot and old pine sap. That was the first thing I noticed when Ethan helped me out of the car. That smell, damp and heavy, like something had been slowly dying inside those walls for years. I didn't say anything about it. I told myself it was just the mountain air, just the cold coming down off the ridgeline, just the way old places smell when they've been shut up too long. I told myself a lot of things in those days. I had gotten very good at it. "It's peaceful up here, Dad," Ethan said, carrying my bag to the front door. He had the key ready, which I thought was strange for a place he claimed was spontaneous. A little retreat, he'd called it, a chance for me to rest and recover after everything I'd been through since Margaret died. He turned the key without fumbling, like he had done it before. "You'll love it once you settle in. Clean air, quiet, no stress." I was 78 years old. I had buried my wife of 44 years 3 months prior. I had signed over the legal authority of my estate, my home, my investment accounts, the business I built from nothing in 1974, to my son 2 weeks after the funeral, because he sat across from me at the kitchen table where Margaret used to drink her morning coffee, and told me with that soft, practiced voice of his that he was worried about me managing everything alone. He said I was grieving. He said I needed to rest. He said, "Dad, let me take care of things for a while. You've been carrying everything your whole life. Let someone else carry it." And I had believed him, because he was my son, because parents believe their children even when they have no good reason to. The inside of the cabin was worse than the outside. A wood stove in the corner, a pile of logs beside it that looked like it had been stacked in a hurry, a cot against the far wall with a single wool blanket, a small kitchen with a 2-burner propane stove and a shelf stocked with canned goods, soup, beans, sardines, a bag of rice. I stood there in the middle of the room and counted the cans in my head without meaning to. Old habit. I had grown up poor enough that counting food was muscle memory. There were maybe 2 weeks of supplies if I stretched them. Maybe. "It's a little rustic," I said. "That's the point." Ethan set my bag down and turned around, smiling. He had Margaret's eyes, that warm, dark brown that made people trust him on sight. I used to love that about him. "You've been living in that big house with all those rooms and all those memories. This is simpler. Good for you." "Where's the nearest town?" He waved his hand in the direction we'd come from. "About 40 minutes down the mountain, but you won't need to go anywhere. You've got everything you need right here." "What about a telephone?" Something crossed his face. "Quick, like a shadow over water." "Cell signal's spotty up here, but I've got your old satellite phone in the bag. Battery's a little low, but it works." He clapped me on the shoulder. Firm, the way you'd grip something you were about to let go of. "I'll be back to check on you in a few days, week at most." I looked at him. My son. The boy I taught to ride a bicycle in the parking lot of the First Baptist on Elm Street. The boy who cried at every pet funeral we held in the backyard. Who once drove 3 hours to return a wallet he'd found at a rest stop because it was the right thing to do, Dad. The man who stood in my kitchen 2 weeks after his mother's funeral and held my hand across the table and told me he loved me. "A week," I said. "Maybe a little longer. I've got a lot to sort through with the estate. You know how lawyers are. Everything takes twice as long as it should." He laughed. It was a good laugh. Easy, practiced. I nodded. I told myself he was right. I told myself I was being paranoid, the way old people get sometimes, seeing shadows in ordinary things. I had spent 44 years married to a woman who always told me I trusted too slow and loved too fast, and I had spent the last 3 months wondering which of us had been right. Ethan hugged me at the door. Brief, one arm, like he was already somewhere else in his head. Then he got in his car, and he drove away. And I stood on that rotting porch and watched his taillights disappear around the first bend in the road. I went inside and checked the satellite phone. The battery was dead. Completely, irreversibly dead. Not low, dead. The kind of dead that doesn't come from a single night without charging. Duh. I want to be careful about how I tell you what happened next, because there is a version of this story where I sound like a foolish old man who walked into an obvious trap with his eyes open, and maybe there's some truth to that. But there is another version, the true version, where you understand that I had just lost the woman I loved more than anything in this world, and grief does something to a person's ability to see clearly. It fogs the glass. It makes the people who are supposed to love you look safer than they are. So let me explain who Ethan was, and who I was, and how we got to that cabin. I built Whitmore Industrial Supply from a rented warehouse in Knoxville, Tennessee in 1974. I was 26 years old, I had $400 in a checking account, and I had a handshake agreement with a construction contractor named Dave Pell, who needed someone reliable to source hardware and materials at a reasonable margin. I worked 16-hour days for 3 years before I hired my first employee. I worked 12-hour days for the next 10 years after that. Margaret kept the books, answered the phones, raised Ethan in the back office on a fold-out playpen, and never once complained that I wasn't home enough, though she would have been right to. By the time I was 50, the business was worth more than I ever expected anything in my life to be worth. I had a proper house with a proper yard. I sent Ethan to a real college, not the community school I'd taken night classes at when I was 22. I gave him every advantage I hadn't had, which is what parents do, which is what parents believe they're supposed to do. What I didn't give him was the experience of building something himself. I know that now. I knew it dimly even then, in the way you know a tooth needs pulling but keep putting off the appointment. Ethan was sharp, genuinely smart, the kind of mind that could read a room and figure out what people wanted to hear before they knew it themselves. But he had never been hungry. Not really. And hunger is the only thing I know of that teaches a person the real value of what they hold. He worked in the business for a while, in his 30s. It didn't take. He told me once that he didn't like the kind of people who worked in industrial supply. A little rough around the edges, Dad. Not really my crowd. And I heard in that sentence everything I should have paid more attention to. I sold the company in 2018 when my knees started giving me trouble, and I put the proceeds into a trust that Margaret and I managed together, and everything was fine. And then Margaret got sick, and then she died. And then Ethan sat across from me at the kitchen table and told me he would take care of everything. I signed the documents he brought. I don't know if you can understand, unless you've lost someone after 44 years, what it feels like to simply not care anymore about the logistics of your own life. I signed because I was tired. I signed because I thought it didn't matter. I signed because I thought my son loved me. What I did not sign, and this is the thing that would save my life, though I didn't know it yet, was a secondary trust document that my attorney, Bernard Caulfield, had drawn up at Margaret's insistence in 2019. She had been quietly worried about Ethan for years, in the way that mothers sometimes see things that fathers don't want to see. She never said it outright. She just asked Bernard to set aside a portion of the estate, the Whitmore family trust, separate and sealed, in an account that only I could access, registered to a post office box in Chattanooga that Ethan had never been told about. She didn't tell me about it either. She left a letter instead. In a sealed envelope in the bottom drawer of her vanity, under a stack of old birthday cards from people we'd mostly forgotten, addressed to me in her handwriting, Harold, only if you need it. I hadn't opened the drawer yet. I hadn't been able to go into her room since the funeral. The first night in the cabin, I didn't sleep. I lay on the cot with the wool blanket pulled to my chest and listened to the mountain make its sounds. Wind through the pines, something moving in the brush outside, the creak and groan of old wood settling in the cold. I ran through the arithmetic in my head the way I used to run through quarterly reports: food supply, temperature, distance to town, physical condition. Knees that ached in the cold. A heart that had been declared in good enough shape at my last physical, but that I had stopped trusting entirely after Margaret's second diagnosis. I was 78 years old, and I was alone on a mountain, and the satellite phone was dead. I did not let myself think the word abandoned. Not yet. Not the first night. In the morning, I found a hand-drawn map tacked to the inside of a kitchen cabinet door. Faint pencil on graph paper showing a rough trail down the mountain with a notation in what might have been Ethan's handwriting. 12 miles / rough terrain. 12 miles. Over mountain trail. In November. I sat at the kitchen table with a can of bean soup I'd heated on the propane stove, and I looked at that map for a long time. There are moments in a life when everything you've been telling yourself cracks open like ice in spring, and the water underneath is cold and very clear and completely unforgiving. Sitting at that table with that soup, looking at that map, I felt the crack. I felt everything I'd been refusing to see for months, maybe years, push through it all at once. Ethan hadn't brought me here to rest. He had brought me here to disappear. I sat with that understanding for a while. I didn't cry. I was surprised by that. I thought I would cry, but I didn't. What I felt instead was something quieter and harder, and much more dangerous than grief. I had felt it only once before in my life, in 1977, when a supplier tried to cheat me out of a contract I'd worked a year to earn. I had felt it then, and I had used it then, and I had not lost. I set down the soup. I got up from the table, and I started to think. Nah, the wood stove worked, which was the first real piece of luck I'd had in months. I rationed the firewood carefully, burning only what I needed to keep the temperature in the cabin survivable. Nights on the mountain were dropping into the low 20s, and the cabin's insulation was essentially non-existent, just old board walls and a tin roof. But the stove threw good heat if I kept it fed, and the stack of logs outside the door was larger than I'd first estimated. Enough for 3 weeks, maybe 4. The food was a tighter problem. I inventoried everything on the second morning, cataloging it with the same precision I'd used to track inventory at the warehouse 40 years before. What I found wasn't nothing, but it wasn't enough. 12 cans of soup, 6 cans of beans, 3 cans of sardines, a 2-pound bag of rice, a half bag of instant oatmeal, a handful of tea bags, and a large container of salt. If I was careful, 1 real meal a day and a small snack at night, I could make it last 3 weeks. If I wasn't careful, 2. What I could not stretch was time. Winter was not waiting. I tried the satellite phone 6 different times over the first 4 days, in case I had somehow misjudged the battery, in case there was some miracle of residual charge I'd missed. There wasn't. I turned it over in my hands on the 4th night, sitting close to the stove, and I thought about what Ethan had said. Battery's a little low. He had known. He had put that phone in the bag knowing exactly what it was. A prop, not a tool. A thing that looked like a lifeline but wasn't. That was the moment it stopped being possible to make excuses for him. I slept badly and woke before light with my jaw set, and my mind doing that thing it used to do in the early years of the business, when I'd be up at 4 in the morning working through problems in the dark before I had the money to worry about them in daylight. Running scenarios. Looking for the angle I hadn't seen yet. There had to be something I hadn't seen yet. I found it on the 5th day by accident. I was searching the cabin more carefully than I had before. Not for supplies this time, but for anything useful. A radio, a flare, a working flashlight. I'd already been through every cabinet and drawer in the kitchen and the main room. What I hadn't done was look under the floorboards. There was a section near the back wall, behind the cot, where the boards were slightly proud of the surrounding floor, raised a 1/4 inch, like something below had shifted. I noticed it when I dragged the cot aside to look for any kind of storage underneath. I pressed the boards with my foot, felt the give. I pried them up with the handle of a kitchen knife, working carefully so I didn't crack the wood. Under the boards was a flat steel lockbox, maybe 14 inches wide and 4 inches deep, with a combination dial lock. It had been down there a long time. There was rust on the edges, dirt packed into the seams. The kind of thing you might put in a place like this and forget about. The kind of thing I might have put in a place like this. I sat back on my heels and stared at it. The cabin was not a random location. I knew that now. I had been working through it for days, asking myself how Ethan had known about this place, who it had belonged to. The answer had been circling the edge of my thinking without landing. Now it landed. I had owned this cabin once. Briefly, in the late 1980s, I had purchased a small parcel of mountain land as a possible hunting retreat, used it twice, decided the drive was too long, and quietly sold it to a man named Curtis Webb around 1991. Except that I had sold the land, and only the land, and not everything on it. I had not thought about it in 20 years. I had certainly not thought to tell Ethan about it, but Ethan must have found the deed somewhere in my papers, must have researched the chain of ownership, must have discovered that the original cabin structure was still there on the parcel, never legally transferred, and then must have thought, here is a place my father doesn't know he still owns, a place no one will look, the combination lock. I sat there for a long time thinking about the lock. I am not a man who uses the same code for everything. Margaret always laughed at me for that, said I'd made a career out of making things unnecessarily complicated. But I do have a small number of codes I've used for important things over the years. My first lock combination in college. The code to the gun safe I kept in my office. The year the business turned its first real profit. The third one opened it. Inside the box were 3 items. A small leather notebook, dry and preserved, my handwriting on the inside front cover. A compact handheld radio transceiver, old but solid, a brand I recognized. The kind of unit that could reach a frequency monitored by rangers. And underneath both of those, sealed in a Ziploc bag that had done its job for however many years they'd been down there, a sheaf of documents. I pulled the documents out first. I didn't recognize them immediately. My hands were not steady. They hadn't been steady since the cabin. The cold was in my joints. Everything hurt. I unfolded the top sheet and read the heading. Whitmore Secondary Trust. Supplemental Asset Schedule. Prepared by Bernard Caulfield, attorney at law. I read it twice. I read it a third time. What I was holding in my hands, in that rotting cabin on a mountain in Tennessee in November, was the paperwork Margaret had arranged without telling me. Not the trust itself, those documents would be in Bernard's office, but the supplemental schedule, a complete accounting of what was in it. I had apparently signed this years ago and filed it here, in a box, in a place I'd forgotten I still owned, as a kind of redundancy that my past self had thought wise and my present self had completely forgotten. The total in that trust, earning interest for 6 years, roughly $4.2 million untouched, in an account Ethan had never known existed, controlled entirely by me. I sat on the cold floorboards of that cabin, and I held those papers against my chest, and I breathed. Then I picked up the radio transceiver, and I started looking for a charged frequency. The signal was weak, but it was there. It took me most of the morning, huddled near the window with the transceiver held at different angles, working through the frequencies methodically. I found a ranger monitoring channel on my third pass. The transmission was broken, intermittent, but it was real. "This is Harold Whitmore," I said. My voice came out rougher than I expected. I had not spoken out loud in 5 days. "I am at a cabin on the mountain at approximately..." I gave them the best coordinates I could construct from the hand-drawn map, the road we'd come in on, the compass direction of the sunrise. "I am 78 years old, and I've been left here without transportation or working communication. I need assistance." I released the transmit button. The radio crackled. A voice came back, distant, layered in static, but human, a real voice. "Sir, please repeat your location. Can you give us a landmark or road name?" I almost laughed. I had not laughed in months. I gave them everything I had, repeated it twice, stayed on the frequency for the next 4 hours until the battery light went amber, and I forced myself to stop transmitting and simply monitor. The ranger on the other end, he told me his name was Chris, and I will not forget it, confirmed he had my location, confirmed he was coordinating with county emergency services, told me to stay warm and stay put. "Is anyone with you?" he asked. "No," I said. A pause. "Are you injured?" "Not physically." Another pause. Longer this time. I got the sense he wanted to ask something else and decided not to. "We'll have someone to you by morning, Mr. Whitmore. Keep the fire going." "I will," I said. "Thank you." I kept the fire going. They reached me at 7:40 the next morning. 2 county emergency workers in an all-terrain vehicle, young men with easy manners and no desire to ask complicated questions, which I appreciated. They brought food and a thermos of coffee and a proper coat, and I ate and drank in the back of their vehicle while one of them radioed ahead. "Is there someone we should contact?" he asked. "Family?" I thought about that for a moment. The honest answer was that my family had left me on a mountain to die. But what I said was, I need to reach my attorney. His name is Bernard Caulfield. He's in Knoxville. I need to speak with him before we do anything else. They looked at each other. The driver, the older one, nodded slowly. We can stop somewhere with a landline on the way down. I'd appreciate that. We drove off the mountain as the sun came up properly over the ridge. I sat in the back seat and watched it through the window, orange and cold and very clear. And I thought about my wife, who had known something was wrong and had arranged a safety net I didn't even know she'd given me, who had loved me that practically, that quietly, that far in advance. Harold, only if you need it. I needed it. I had not cried since the funeral. 3 months of carrying everything inside a closed fist, the way I carried things, the way I had always carried things. But sitting in the back of that truck, watching the sunrise come over the ridge, I cried. Just for a few minutes, just for her, for what she'd seen coming that I refused to, for the way she'd protected me from a direction I never thought to look. Then I wiped my face and I pulled out the supplemental trust documents and I started making notes in the margins. Bernard Caulfield picked up on the second ring. I could hear the confusion in his voice when I identified myself. Not surprised that I was calling, but surprised at something underneath the call that he was still catching up to. Harold, I tried to reach you twice last week. Your son told me you'd gone on a trip and left your phone behind. He said you needed to disconnect for a while. I was on a mountain, I said. I've been there for 6 days. My son drove me there and left me. The silence on the other end lasted long enough that I heard Bernard set something down. Say that again. I was abandoned at a cabin in the mountains. No transportation, no working communication, inadequate food supply. Winter conditions. I kept my voice flat. I had learned a long time ago that flat voices in hard conversations are more powerful than emotional ones. I want you to tell me what has happened with the estate since the documents I signed. Another silence. Then, Harold, I need you to come to my office, today if possible. I'm on my way down the mountain right now. I'll be in Knoxville by noon. I'll be here. His voice had changed, become careful, precise, the way attorney voices get when something serious is happening and they need to be very exact about what they say and how they say it. And Harold, the secondary trust. Has anyone accessed it? Not possible, I said. Only I can access it. Good. A breath. Come straight here. Don't talk to Ethan first. Don't signal in any way that you've surfaced. Can you do that? I looked out the window at the mountain falling away behind us. I've been doing it for 6 days, I said. Bertuk. Bernard's office was on the 4th floor of a building on Gay Street that had been there since 1982 and smelled like paper and old carpet and the specific institutional seriousness of a place where important decisions get made. I had been coming to this office since 1985. I knew the receptionist's name, Darlene, and she knew mine, and when I walked in at 12:15 with 2 days of beard and borrowed clothes and the look of a man who had been through something, she stood up from her desk. Mr. Whitmore, she said, and then, because Darlene was a practical woman who did not waste words, are you all right? Working on it, I said. Bernard's expecting me. Bernard was a man in his late 60s who had been my attorney long enough that I trusted him the way you trust a doctor who has seen you at your worst, without sentiment, based purely on evidence. He met me at his office door and shook my hand with both of his, looked at my face for a moment, then closed the door behind us. Sit, he said. He poured me coffee without asking. I sat. I took the coffee. And then he told me what had happened in the 10 days since I'd signed those documents at my kitchen table. The picture he described was efficient in the way that only planned things are efficient. Ethan had moved quickly once the power of attorney was secured. 2 of the primary investment accounts had been partially liquidated. The house, Margaret's house, our house, the house on Ellsworth Street where we'd lived for 30 years, had been listed with an agency, quietly, not yet publicly, but the listing was active. A conversation had been initiated with an estate attorney in Nashville about the primary trust disbursement, framed as a proactive administrative step to prepare for eventual transfer of assets. Eventual. As if I were already in the past tense. He's been operating as if I'm gone, I said. Bernard looked at me across his desk. He's been operating as if you would be gone. There's a difference, legally, but not much of one morally. What's my position? Your position, Bernard said, is strong. The power of attorney document you signed is valid, but it doesn't supersede your own legal standing while you are alive and competent. The secondary trust is completely untouched and completely protected. Ethan was never listed as a beneficiary and has no access or claim. The primary estate actions he's initiated are reversible as long as they haven't completed. The house listing hasn't closed. The liquidations were partial. He has been careful, but not careful enough. Bernard paused. He thought he had more time. He thought I was going to die on that mountain. Bernard didn't flinch. Yes, I believe that's the correct interpretation. I looked at my hands on his desk. Old hands, scarred in 3 places from work accidents in the early years when I did everything myself because I couldn't afford to hire anyone. I had built things with these hands, actual physical things, back when the company was small enough that I moved inventory myself. I had held Margaret's hand for 44 years. I had held Ethan's hand when he was a boy, afraid of thunder. What do I do? I asked, although I already knew. We document everything, Bernard said. The abandonment, the timeline, the state of the cabin, the satellite phone, the food supply, everything you can remember and verify. We contact law enforcement, and we cooperate fully with whatever investigation results. And we appear, in force, at the estate hearing scheduled for December 3rd, which Ethan has arranged and does not expect you to attend. December 3rd. He filed it 8 days ago. I received the notification but couldn't reach you. Bernard's voice stayed steady. It's in 3 weeks. 3 weeks. My son had given himself 3 weeks from the moment he drove away from that cabin. 3 weeks that were probably intended to be enough time for a 78-year-old man in poor conditions on a mountain in November to stop being a problem. He had miscalculated. What do I need to do between now and December 3rd? I asked. Bernard picked up his pen. Old habit, he thought better with something in his hand. You need to rest. You need a full medical evaluation documented by a physician to establish your current cognitive and physical status on record. You need to stay completely off Ethan's radar, and you need to let me work. I nodded. I drank the last of the coffee. It had gone cold. There's one more thing, I said. I reached into the inside pocket of the borrowed coat and placed the supplemental trust documents on his desk, the ones I'd found in the lockbox under the cabin floor, the ones Margaret had arranged in 2019. Bernard picked them up, read the first page, set them down, looked at me. She didn't tell me about it, I said. She asked me not to, he said. She said... He stopped. What did she say? Bernard was quiet for a moment. The afternoon light was coming through the window behind him, catching the dust in the air. She said she hoped you'd never need to know about it, but she wanted to make sure it was there if you did. I sat with that for a moment. Outside, through the window, I could hear the ordinary sounds of a city in November. Traffic, wind, someone's radio. The sounds of the world that had continued going while I was on that mountain, not knowing whether I would ever be part of it again. All right, I said finally, let's get to work. Bernard's office became my command center for the next 3 days. That's not a metaphor. I mean it literally. I slept on the fold-out couch in his back room, the one he kept for late nights during trials, because I had nowhere else to go. The house on Ellsworth Street was legally accessible to me, but going back there meant Ethan would know I'd surfaced, and Bernard had been very clear on that point. Stay off his radar until December 3rd. So I slept on that couch under a spare blanket Darlene brought from her car, and I ate takeout from the Thai place 2 blocks down. And I spent my days sitting across from Bernard going through every document, every account statement, every transaction Ethan had made in the 10 days since I'd signed those papers at my kitchen table. The picture that emerged was not the work of a desperate man acting impulsively. It was the work of someone who had been planning for a long time. The first account Ethan had touched was the primary brokerage, which held the largest portion of my liquid assets. He had moved carefully there, not emptying it, which would have triggered immediate flags, but liquidating positions in chunks, spacing the transactions 2 or 3 days apart, moving the cash into a holding account in his own name. Bernard's forensic accountant, a quiet woman named Patricia Stern, who wore reading glasses on a chain and said almost nothing except when she was telling you something important, spread the statements across the conference table and traced the pattern with her finger. He moved $460,000 in 11 days, she said. Same-day transfers to an account at a Nashville bank. The account was opened 8 weeks ago. 8 weeks ago. While Margaret was still fresh in the ground. While I was still sleeping in the chair in the living room because I couldn't face the bedroom we'd shared. He opened the account before he had the power of attorney, I said. Patricia looked at me over her glasses. Yes. I sat with that. I had already accepted that my son had planned this. Knowing it and feeling it are different countries, and I kept having to cross the border between them. Every new piece of evidence was another border crossing. The Nashville account, 8 weeks ago, while I was grieving. He had been sitting across from me at that kitchen table, holding my hand, and he had already opened the account. What about the house? I asked. Bernard answered that one. The listing agent was a woman in Green Hills who had apparently been told by Ethan that his father was in declining health and had decided to downsize, willingly, comfortably, without any urgency. The asking price was below market, which Bernard said was consistent with wanting a fast sale rather than a profitable one. A buyer had already submitted an offer. It hadn't been accepted yet. Can we stop it? I asked. Already done, Bernard said. I contacted the listing agent this morning and informed her that the seller, you, has not authorized the listing and that any transaction proceeding without direct confirmation from you constitutes fraud. She pulled it within the hour. She was not happy, but she understood the liability. And Ethan? Doesn't know yet. The agent reached out to him, but he hasn't returned the call. Bernard paused. He will, eventually. When he does, we need to be ready. The medical evaluation happened on the second day. Bernard arranged it through a physician he trusted, a geriatric specialist named Dr. Anita Foley, who had an office in West Knoxville and a manner so calm and direct that I immediately liked her. She examined me for 2 hours, asked questions about my cognition and memory that I recognized as the standard battery for establishing competency, and drew enough blood to satisfy whatever legal standard Bernard needed satisfied. You're in reasonably good shape for a man who spent 6 days in a mountain cabin in November, she told me afterward, sitting across from me in her office. Mild dehydration, some joint inflammation from the cold, and your blood pressure is elevated, which I'd expect given the circumstances. But there's nothing here that would support any argument of cognitive decline or incapacity. That's what my son will argue, I said, if it comes to it. She looked at me steadily. Then I'll say the same thing under oath that I'm saying to you now. She closed the folder. Mr. Whitmore, I see a lot of older adults in my practice. A significant number of them have been through something like what you've been through. Maybe not exactly this, but some version of it. A family member making decisions about their life and their assets without genuinely asking them. Sometimes it's subtle. Sometimes it's not. She paused. What happened to you was not subtle. No, I said. It wasn't. I thanked her and I went back to Bernard's office, and I did not let myself think about what it meant that what had been done to me was not unusual enough to surprise a physician who dealt with old people every day. I filed that thought away for later, the way I'd always filed the things that were too large to look at directly when there was still work to do. On the third day, Patricia Stern found the second account. She found it buried in a cross-reference between Ethan's personal tax filings from 2 years prior and a financial disclosure he'd submitted as part of a business credit application. It was a corporate entity, a limited liability company registered in Delaware, named something generic, the kind of name that sounds like a consulting firm and means nothing to anyone who doesn't already know what it is. The company had been incorporated 3 years ago. It had one member, Ethan. He's been planning this for 3 years, I said. Patricia set the paper down. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. 3 years. My wife had been alive 3 years ago. She had been in the early stages of her illness, but she had been alive, and she had been sharp. And she had apparently been watching something in our son that I refused to see. That was why she'd asked Bernard about the secondary trust. That was why she'd left the letter in the drawer. She had been watching, and she had been quietly building a wall between me and something she could see coming and I could not. I thought about that letter still sitting in the drawer of her vanity, unopened, back in the house I currently couldn't go to. Harold, only if you need it. I had needed it for 6 days already, and I still hadn't read it. I need to go to the house, I told Bernard that afternoon. He looked up from the document he was reviewing. Harold, not to stay, not to announce myself. I need to get something from the bedroom, something Margaret left. I watched him process this. Ethan isn't living there. He has his own place in Nashville. The house is sitting empty. It was listed, not occupied. Bernard thought about it for a moment. How long do you need? 20 minutes. Darlene will drive you. You go in, you get what you need, you come straight back. You don't stay, you don't turn any lights on that can be seen from the street, and you don't touch anything related to the estate. Understood. He held my gaze for a moment longer, the way he did when he was deciding whether to push back further. Then he reached for his phone to call Darlene. The house on Ellsworth Street looked wrong from the outside. I couldn't have explained exactly how. Nothing was visibly different. The lawn was cut. The porch light was on the timer the way it always was. But it looked wrong the way a face looks wrong when the person behind it is feeling something they're not showing. Like the house itself knew something had changed and couldn't quite conceal it. Darlene waited in the car. I went in through the side door, which I'd kept a key for in my wallet for 30 years, and which Ethan apparently hadn't thought to rekey because why would he? I was supposed to be on a mountain. Inside was cold. Someone had turned the heat down, probably Ethan on one of his visits, the kind of small practicality that wouldn't have occurred to me as evidence of anything except that it was his way of saying the house was already his. The smell was still Margaret's, though. That particular combination of the soap she used and the wood of the floors, and something underneath that was just her, the way houses absorb people over decades. Standing in the hallway, I had to stop and breathe for a moment. I went straight to the bedroom, didn't let myself look at anything else. Didn't look at her reading chair in the corner, or the books stacked on her nightstand, or the indentation in the mattress that was still, 3 months later, unmistakably hers. I went to the vanity, opened the bottom drawer. The stack of birthday cards was there. Under them, the white envelope, sealed, my name on the front in her handwriting. I had looked at it once, the week after the funeral, and closed the drawer and not opened it again. I took it now. I also took the photograph from the top of the vanity, the one of the two of us at the lake. 1988, both of us younger and easier in our bodies, squinting into the sun. Margaret laughing at something I'd said. I had wanted that photograph every day since she died, and I hadn't let myself go in to get it. I tucked both under my arm. I went back through the house, not looking at anything, not stopping. I locked the side door behind me. I got in the car. Darlene didn't ask any questions. She just drove. I read Margaret's letter that night on the fold-out couch, after Bernard had gone home and the office was quiet. I'm not going to tell you everything she wrote. Some things are private, and that letter was private in a way that I want to keep private even now, even telling you all of this. But I will tell you what mattered, which was this. She said she had watched Ethan for years with the particular watchfulness of a mother who loves her child and is afraid of what she sees in him. She said she had tried to talk to me about it 3 or 4 times and stopped because she could see it would only make me angry or sad, and she didn't want to spend whatever time she had left making me feel either of those things. She said she was sorry she hadn't pushed harder. Then she said, I know you will want to forgive him. You have always been a man who finds a way to forgive the people you love. I'm not asking you not to forgive him. I'm asking you to protect yourself first. Those 2 things can both be true at the same time. Please let them both be true. I folded the letter and I put it in my shirt pocket, and I kept it there for the rest of what came. Day 7 of being back in the world, Ethan called Bernard's office. Darlene brought Bernard the message. Ethan Whitmore called at 2:15 p.m., said it was about his father's estate, asked for a call back. Bernard called him back from the conference room with me sitting across the table, the call on speaker, both of us very still. Bernard. Ethan's voice was smooth, controlled. I had a sudden memory of him at 14 explaining to me why a dent appeared in the car he'd been told not to drive, and having that same quality of voice, not nervous, not hurried, just arranged. Thanks for getting back to me. I've been trying to sort out a few things on Dad's behalf, and I keep running into administrative issues. I was hoping you could help me work through them. What kind of issues? Bernard said. The house listing got pulled. Some kind of confusion with the agent. She seems to have gotten the wrong message about authorization. I want to get it relisted as soon as possible. Who authorized the original listing? A pause. Brief. Almost imperceptible. I did, on my father's behalf. I have power of attorney. Your father is alive and competent, Ethan. A power of attorney is an authorization, not a transfer of identity. The property belongs to Harold. A listing requires his direct consent. Another pause, longer this time. My father is on a rest trip. He's not currently reachable. When did you last speak with him? A week and a half ago. He wanted time away from everything. You know how he's been since Mom died. I'm just trying to handle things while he rests. Bernard looked at me across the table. His expression was exactly what you'd expect from a man who has spent 40 years in law and has heard a great many people say untrue things into telephone receivers. Entirely professionally neutral. I'd recommend you hold off on any estate actions until you've been in direct contact with your father, Bernard said, for everyone's protection. Bernard, I'll be in touch, Ethan. He ended the call. We sat in the quiet of the conference room for a moment. The afternoon light came through the blinds in long stripes across the table. He knows something is wrong, I said. He suspects something. He doesn't know what. Bernard set his pen down. He'll move faster now. We need to be ready. That was the moment I understood that the 3 weeks until December 3rd were not a countdown to my victory. They were a countdown to a race, and the other runner had just realized he was behind. But what happened in the 10 days that followed was the kind of legal warfare that looks orderly from the outside and feels like drowning from the inside. Ethan retained a lawyer of his own, a Nashville firm, aggressive, the kind that sends letters with a lot of bold text designed to make you feel like the ground is moving under your feet. His attorney filed a motion asserting that the December 3rd hearing should proceed as scheduled on the grounds that Harold Whitmore had been declared. And here's the word they used, the word that hit me in the chest the way they intended it to, potentially incapacitated due to age, grief, and undisclosed medical concerns. He was trying to have me declared incompetent before I could walk into that courtroom. Patricia Stern sat across from me when I read the filing and watched my face with the calm of someone who had seen this before. This is standard, she said. When someone realizes a competent party is about to appear and contest a proceeding they thought was uncontested, this is what they do. They try to eliminate the party before the hearing. Can they do it? Not with the medical documentation we have from Dr. Foley. Not unless they can produce their own physician's evaluation, and they can't do that without your consent or a court order. She paused. What they're doing is delaying and muddying, making noise. Will it work? Not if we're loud enough back. Bernard filed a counter-response that same week, a formal objection to the competency motion, accompanied by Dr. Foley's documented evaluation, a notarized statement from me attesting to my full cognitive capacity, and a request for an emergency protective order to freeze all estate actions pending the December 3rd hearing. The judge who reviewed it, a woman named Judge Elaine Hargrove, who Bernard said had been on the bench for 22 years and was known for taking a dim view of procedural maneuvering, issued the freeze within 48 hours. Every account, every asset, every pending transaction. Frozen. I got a phone call that night, not on Bernard's number, on a number that turned out to be a prepaid phone, but I recognized the voice immediately. Dad. I sat very still. I know you're back, Ethan said. His voice was different than it had been on the call with Bernard. The arrangement was gone. Underneath it was something raw, something that might have been anger or might have been fear, and I found I couldn't tell which. I don't know exactly what you think you know, but I think we should talk, before this gets any more complicated than it needs to be. I said nothing. Dad, come on. I know you're listening. A sound that might have been a breath or a laugh, I couldn't tell. Everything I did because I was worried about you. You weren't managing. You were depressed. You weren't thinking clearly. I was trying to protect the assets while you got your head right. That's all this was. The cabin, the dead satellite phone, the canned goods stacked on the shelf. The cabin was comfortable, he continued. I knew you'd have time to rest and think. I was going to come get you. I just needed a few days to sort some things out first. I thought about the hand-drawn map with 12 miles/rough terrain written on it in his handwriting. I thought about the food supply I'd counted and recounted in the dark. I thought about Chris the ranger and the transceiver and the way my hands had shaken on that first transmission. How long? I said. What? How long were you going to leave me there? The silence stretched. In it, I heard everything he wasn't saying and everything he didn't know I already knew. Dad, I think we should meet in person. I'll see you on December 3rd, I said. I ended the call. I set the phone down on the conference room table and I sat in the dark office for a long time after that, alone, listening to the city outside and trying to figure out what I was feeling. Not triumph, not even anger exactly. Something more like the feeling you get when you've been carrying something heavy for a very long time and you've finally set it down in the right place. A specific kind of exhausted clarity, clean and cold, and absolutely certain. He had wanted me gone. He had planned it carefully, waited for the right moment, and driven me up a mountain. He had done it not in a rage, not in desperation, but methodically over time, the way you execute a plan you've been building for years. And he had called my cell phone tonight with that voice and that story about protection and assets. And he had expected me to waver. He had expected, even now, that I was still the father who wanted to believe him. The father who had taught him to ride a bike and driven 3 hours to collect him from a college dormitory at 2 a.m. when his roommate situation fell apart. The father who had signed documents at a kitchen table because he was too deep in grief to see straight. He had expected me to still be that man. I was still that man, in some ways. I expect I always would be. But I was also 78 years old, and I had spent 6 days on a mountain that my son had chosen because he thought I would not survive it, and I had survived it, and I had found what my wife left me, and I was not going to waver. Not now. Not for anything. The morning of December 3rd, I woke at 4:15. Not because an alarm went off, not because the fold-out couch was uncomfortable, though it was. I woke because my body understood before my mind did that this was the day everything would either hold or break, and it refused to let me sleep through the approach of it. I lay there in the dark of Bernard's back room, and I did what I had always done before the days that mattered. I went through it all in my head, every piece, every sequence, every possible response to every possible move. It was the same thing I used to do the night before a major contract negotiation, back when the company was still young enough that losing a deal could genuinely threaten the whole operation. I had never been able to explain to Margaret why I did it. She thought it was anxiety, thought I was catastrophizing, would put her hand on my arm in the dark and say, "Harold, you've already done the work. Let it rest." But it wasn't anxiety. It was just the way my brain verified that everything was in place, like running a pre-flight checklist. If I found a gap in the dark, I still had time to fill it. I found no gaps. That didn't make me feel better exactly. It made me feel ready, which is a different thing. Bernard arrived at 7. He was wearing the charcoal suit he'd told me was his courtroom suit, the one he'd bought in 1998 and had altered twice as his body changed but refused to replace because, as he put it, juries and judges have seen this suit win before, and I want that history in the room. He brought coffee and 2 egg sandwiches from the place on the corner, and he sat across from me at the conference table, and we ate without talking much, the way people eat before something serious. "How are you feeling?" he finally asked. "Like a 78-year-old man who slept on a fold-out couch," I said. He almost smiled. "Good. That's exactly how you should look walking into that room." Patricia Stern arrived at 8 with the full document package, 3 copies of everything organized and tabbed with the particular precision that I had come to understand was simply how she existed in the world. She set the folders on the table and went through each section once, quickly, making sure I understood what was where and why. She had the manner of someone who did not believe in last-minute surprises and had arranged her life to prevent them. "The secondary trust documentation is the anchor," she said, tapping the thickest folder. "Everything else supports it or builds on it. The transaction records show intent. The medical evaluation establishes competency. The emergency services report establishes the abandonment timeline." She looked at me over her glasses. "When Judge Hargrove sees this in sequence, the picture is unambiguous." When will Ethan see it? I asked. When you walk through the door, Bernard said. His attorneys received the standard discovery package, but the secondary trust documentation is new. We filed it as supplemental evidence yesterday afternoon. They know something is coming. They don't know what. I nodded. I picked up my coffee and finished it, and thought about my son sitting somewhere across the city this morning, in his own suit with his own attorneys, going through his own version of the pre-flight checklist. I wondered if he was afraid. I wondered if he had slept. I found I could wonder these things without the wondering pulling me off course, which felt like the first clean sign that I was where I needed to be in my own head. We left for the courthouse at 8:45. The Knox County Courthouse had been on Main Street since before I was born, and I had been inside it exactly twice in my life, once in 1989 to file a business dispute that resolved before it went anywhere, and once in 2003 when Margaret served on a jury for 2 weeks, and I brought her lunch on the third day because she called to tell me the vending machine food was inhumane. Both times, it had been an ordinary building doing ordinary bureaucratic work. Walking in through the front entrance on the morning of December 3rd, it felt like something else entirely. The marble floors and high ceilings, and the smell of the place, old paper and floor cleaner, and something underneath that might just be the accumulated weight of decisions made inside those walls for 100 years. It felt, for the first time in my experience of it, like a place where things actually got settled. Bernard had arranged for us to enter through a side corridor to avoid the main lobby. He had timed it so we would arrive after Ethan and his team were already seated, which was a deliberate choice. Let them believe right up until the last possible moment that this was going to be what they expected it to be. An uncontested proceeding. A formality. A room full of lawyers arranging the estate of an old man who was somewhere on a mountain, not getting any healthier. We stopped outside the courtroom doors. Bernard straightened his jacket. Patricia tucked the folders under her arm. I checked my watch. Force of habit, I had checked my watch before every significant meeting of my professional life. 8:58. Ready? Bernard said. I thought about the cabin, the dead satellite phone, the hand-drawn map. I thought about Margaret's letter folded in my shirt pocket, where I'd kept it every day for 3 weeks because it was the closest I could get to having her beside me. Yes, I said. Bernard pushed open the door. The room was not large. Courtrooms in county court rarely are. This was not a trial, just a scheduled hearing, and the space reflected that. 2 long tables facing the judge's bench, a gallery of maybe a dozen seats, most of them empty except for a young woman with a legal pad near the back, who I would later learn was a court reporter for one of the local news outlets, apparently tipped that something worth covering was happening here today. Bernard had tipped her himself, which I had not known until afterward. Ethan was at the left table with 2 attorneys I didn't recognize. A man in his 50s who had the bearing of someone who charged a great deal per hour, and a younger woman who was already looking at her phone when we walked in. A court clerk stood near the judge's bench, organizing something. A bailiff near the side door. 4 other people I didn't immediately identify. 2 of them, I would learn, were investigators from the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation who Bernard had quietly coordinated with over the past 2 weeks, present at the request of the district attorney's office. I walked in behind Bernard and Patricia, and I watched the moment it happened. Ethan was looking down at the documents in front of him. His senior attorney said something to him in a low voice. Ethan glanced up. The automatic, unfocused glance of someone expecting to see court staff or opposing counsel. His eyes moved past me, started to move back to his documents. Then they stopped. I watched him look at me. I watched the blood drain from his face in a way I had never seen happen to a human being in real time. A visible physical thing, like watching water recede. His mouth opened slightly. His hands, flat on the table, went completely still. I met his eyes. I did not look away. I did not try to make my expression anything in particular. I wasn't angry. I wasn't triumphant. I wasn't performing anything. I was just there, present, alive, the thing he had arranged for me not to be. His senior attorney looked at him, then looked at us, then looked back at Ethan. Ethan, he said quietly but sharply. Who is that? Ethan said nothing for a moment, then, That's my father? The attorney's face went through its own rapid sequence of adjustments. He leaned close to Ethan and said something I couldn't hear. Ethan shook his head slightly, the small, tight motion of someone receiving information they don't want to be receiving. Bernard led me to the right-hand table. We sat. Patricia laid the folders out in their sequence. The clerk announced that Judge Hargrove would be entering momentarily. The room felt like the moment before weather, that particular density in the air when a storm is close enough to change the pressure but hasn't yet broken. I kept my hands flat on the table, the way I always did when I needed to stay level. My knees ached from the courthouse stairs. I was aware, at the same time, that I was 78 years old and tired in the particular way you get tired when you have been surviving something for a long time and the surviving is almost done. I was also the most awake I had been in months. Both of these things were simultaneously true, and I did not try to resolve them. Judge Elaine Hargrove entered at 9:02, which Bernard later told me was unusually prompt for her. She was a compact woman in her mid-60s with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead and the specific economy of movement that experienced judges develop. No wasted gestures, no performance, just presence. She sat, arranged her materials, looked once around the room, and stopped when she reached our table. "I see we have additional parties present," she said. Her voice was even, not particularly surprised. "Counsel, please identify yourselves and your clients for the record." Bernard stood. "Bernard Caulfield, Your Honor, counsel for Harold James Whitmore." He paused. "Who is present and appearing in person?" Another pause in the room, the kind that has weight. Judge Hargrove looked at me directly. "Mr. Whitmore?" "Your Honor," I said. She held my gaze for a moment, appraising, not unkind, then turned to the left table. "Counsel for the petitioner." Ethan's senior attorney stood. His name, I would learn, was Michael Graves. He was good. I could tell that immediately, from the way he collected himself in the 3 seconds between being called upon and opening his mouth. Another man might have shown the disruption. Graves showed nothing except professional composure. "Michael Graves and Sarah Lee, Your Honor, counsel for Ethan Whitmore as authorized agent for the Harold Whitmore estate." Petitioner's motion before the court today is a request for estate administration authorization, Judge Hargrove said. "Given the appearance of the principal himself, I have some preliminary questions before we proceed." She looked at Graves. "Is it the petitioner's position that the principal is incapacitated?" Graves glanced at Ethan. "A microsecond, nothing more." "Your Honor, the petitioner has expressed concerns about the principal's capacity to manage his affairs, particularly in the context of recent bereavement, and is there a medical evaluation on record to support that position?" "We have been in the process of arranging—" "Mr. Caulfield," Judge Hargrove said, turning to Bernard, "does the principal's counsel have documentation regarding Mr. Whitmore's current capacity?" Bernard stood. "Yes, Your Honor. A comprehensive evaluation by Dr. Anita Foley, certified geriatric specialist, conducted 12 days ago and submitted as part of our supplemental filing." He passed a copy to the clerk. "Dr. Foley's conclusion is unambiguous. Mr. Whitmore presents no indicators of cognitive decline, incapacity, or diminished decision-making ability." Graves was on his feet again before Bernard had finished sitting. "Your Honor, we would object to the late supplemental filing." "Noted," Judge Hargrove said, in the tone of someone who has noted things and then moved past them 10,000 times. "We'll address the filing procedurally in a moment. Mr. Caulfield, your client is present and apparently prepared to speak for himself. Do you have additional material you intend to introduce?" "We do, Your Honor. Substantial material." Bernard's voice was exactly what it had always been in the years I'd known him. Measured, certain, carrying the specific weight of a man who does not say things he cannot back up. "With the court's permission, we would ask that before any estate authorization question is addressed, the court hear evidence related to the circumstances under which the power of attorney at the center of this proceeding was executed, and what occurred in the weeks immediately following its execution." Judge Hargrove looked at him, then at me, then at Graves, who had the expression of a man watching a floor give way under him but maintaining the professional discipline not to grab for the walls. "I'll hear it," she said. What followed was the most important 2 hours of my life since the morning Margaret was diagnosed. Bernard took the room through it methodically. Not dramatically, not with the kind of theatrical pacing you see in television courtrooms, but with the flat, cumulative power of documented fact laid down piece by piece until the shape of what had happened was unavoidable. He started with the power of attorney signing, the date, the context of my bereavement, the speed with which estate actions had followed. He introduced Patricia Stern's transaction analysis. The $460,000 moved in 11 days. The Delaware LLC opened 3 years prior. The Nashville account opened 8 weeks before the power of attorney was ever signed. That last piece landed visibly. Even Judge Hargrove, whose face throughout had maintained the careful neutrality of the bench, made a small note. Then Bernard introduced the cabin. He did it with the County Emergency Services report first, the official documentation of my rescue, the recorded transmission on the Ranger frequency, Chris's log of the call with coordinates and timestamps. He introduced the photographs the emergency workers had taken of the cabin interior. Standard documentation for a welfare call, capturing the wood stove, the single cot, the shelf of supplies, the dead satellite phone on the kitchen table where I'd left it. He introduced the hand-drawn map, which had been preserved in the emergency services documentation as evidence of the location. Then he asked me to speak. I had not testified before, not in any legal proceeding in my life. Bernard had prepared me for it, told me to speak plainly, not to argue, not to editorialize, to answer questions directly, and let the facts carry the weight. So that is what I did. I described the drive to the mountain, the cabin, the phone, the food supply I'd counted, the 6 days, the transceiver in the lockbox, Margaret's documents. I kept my voice level. I had been keeping my voice level in hard conversations for 50 years, and I kept it level now. I looked at Judge Hargrove when I spoke, not at Ethan, because I had decided before I walked into that room that I was not going to perform my pain for my son's benefit. He knew what he had done. I didn't need to make him feel it. But then Bernard asked me one question I hadn't anticipated quite the way he asked it. Mr. Whitmore, at any point during those 6 days, did you believe you might not survive? I paused. Not because I didn't know the answer, because the answer was the truest thing I'd said out loud since any of this began, and I wanted to be accurate about it. On the 4th night, I said, the temperature dropped below what I could reliably manage with the wood I had left. I had to make a decision about how to ration it through to morning. I did the math. It was close. I paused again. Yes, I thought I might not survive. The courtroom was very quiet. I heard from Ethan's direction the sound of a chair shifting. I didn't look. And the satellite phone your son provided was completely dead when I checked it the first night. Not low battery, dead. It had not been charged in days, possibly longer. Bernard nodded and thanked me and sat down. Graves cross-examined me for 40 minutes, and he was skilled at it. He probed for inconsistencies in the timeline, suggested I might have misjudged the satellite phone's condition, implied that a man in grief might misread a son's concern as something more sinister. He was careful not to be aggressive, because aggressive toward a 78-year-old man who had just described surviving 6 days alone on a mountain would have been a catastrophic read of the room. But he worked the edges of everything, looking for purchase. He didn't find much. I had spent 50 years in business negotiations with people who wanted to find purchase where there wasn't any. When Graves sat down, Bernard introduced the final piece, the Whitmore Secondary Trust documentation, complete and certified, showing the $4.2 million in assets that had never appeared in any disclosure Ethan had made to his attorneys, to the court, or to anyone else. Showing that the estate Ethan had presented himself as administering was, in fact, substantially incomplete, that there was a significant portion of my wealth that his power of attorney did not touch, had never touched, and which remained entirely under my control. The effect in the room was the particular silence that follows something irrevocable. Graves requested a recess. Judge Hargrove granted 15 minutes. During the recess, I sat at the table and drank water from a plastic cup and did not turn around. Bernard sat beside me. Patricia organized her folders with the same methodical calm she'd had all morning. At some point I heard, from the other table, the sound of Graves's voice, low and tight, saying something to Ethan that I couldn't make out. And then Ethan's voice, lower still, saying something back. And then a longer silence. Bernard leaned toward me. His attorneys are going to recommend he settle, he said quietly. Graves is good enough to know when the case is gone. And Ethan? Bernard considered. That depends on how well he can hear advice when it's not what he wants to hear. I thought about the answer to that and said nothing. Judge Hargrove reconvened at 10:55. She was brisk about it. The 15 minutes had apparently clarified her thinking as much as anyone else's. Before we hear any further argument, she said, I want to address the threshold question of the power of attorney's scope, given what has been presented today. Counsel for the petitioner, is your client prepared to continue on the current motion? Graves stood. Even now, under everything, he had that composure. I gave him that. Your Honor, in light of the supplemental materials introduced by opposing counsel this morning, we would request a continuance to allow petitioner's team adequate time to review. The supplemental filing was made 48 hours ago, Mr. Graves. She looked at him evenly. That is adequate notice for a hearing of this nature. What I am hearing this morning is a request for a state administration authorization on behalf of a man who is present in this courtroom, has demonstrated full legal competency, and has introduced substantial evidence that the petitioner was operating under a materially incomplete representation of the estate's composition. She paused. The motion for a state administration authorization is denied. She turned to address both tables together. I am also referring the matter of the documented financial transactions and the circumstances described in today's testimony to the district attorney's office for review. The investigators present today, she acknowledged briefly the two TBI investigators near the back. Will coordinate with my clerk for documentation access. She looked at Graves. Mr. Graves, I trust you will advise your client accordingly regarding his cooperation. Graves said, Yes, Your Honor, in the voice of a man who has already moved past today and is doing the math on tomorrow. Judge Hargrove's gaze moved to me one final time. It was not soft. She was not a soft woman, and this was not a soft moment. But there was something in it that I recognized as acknowledgement, not sympathy, just the recognition of one person who has kept their footing in difficult terrain by another person who understands what that costs. Mr. Whitmore, she said, your estate remains under your authority. I'd advise you to consult with your attorney about any remedial actions you wish to pursue. Thank you, Your Honor, I said. She gathered her materials and left the bench. The room broke apart the way rooms do when something conclusive has happened. Movement, voices, the shuffle of papers and chairs. I stayed seated. My knees were not going to let me stand quickly, and I had already decided not to try. Bernard was talking to someone behind me. Patricia was making notes on the last folder. Ethan had not spoken a word throughout the entire proceeding. Not one word. His attorneys had spoken for him, around him, in his name. But he himself had sat at that table for 2 hours in complete silence while the room assembled the picture of what he had done and held it up in the light. I didn't know what I expected him to do when the room cleared. Leave immediately, probably. That would have been the strategically sound thing, given that his lawyers were going to want to get him somewhere they could talk without witnesses. I wasn't watching for him. I was watching my own hands on the table and thinking about Margaret's letter and wondering, the way I had wondered many times in the past 3 weeks, whether this was what she'd imagined when she arranged everything, whether this was the outcome she'd been quietly building toward, or whether she'd hoped it would never be necessary at all. I felt him before I heard him, or maybe it was the absence of all other sound. The room had emptied faster than I'd realized, and suddenly the only footsteps left were his, crossing the floor toward me. I looked up. Ethan stopped a few feet from the table. He looked... I want to be accurate about this. He looked like a man who has run very far in one direction and has just reached the edge of what the land will support. Not broken, not remorseful. Something closer to exhausted or to the particular kind of fear that comes not from what you've lost, but from the recognition of what you've become. He said, Dad, just that, just my name. I looked at him for a long moment. My son, 51 years old. Margaret's eyes. You should go with your attorneys, I said. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. I didn't think... He stopped. I know what you thought, I said. He stood there another moment. And then, because there was nothing left to say, and because his lawyers were waiting, and because the room was empty and the judge was gone, and the thing he had built over 3 years had come apart in 2 hours in a county courtroom, he turned and walked out. I sat alone at the table for a while after that. My knees hurt, my back hurt. I was hungry and tired, and the plastic cup of water in front of me had gone lukewarm. I was alive, and my estate was intact, and my son was going to face consequences that I had not, in 51 years of loving him, ever imagined I would be the one to set in motion. None of it felt the way I'd thought it would feel. I picked up Margaret's letter from my shirt pocket. I didn't open it. I had it memorized by now, every word. I just held it in my hands for a moment, the paper worn soft from 3 weeks of being carried. Then Bernard came back through the door and said, "Harold, you ready?" I put the letter away. I put my hands on the table and I pushed myself to my feet, knees protesting, back tight, the ordinary rebellion of an old body that has been through too much in too short a time. "Yes," I said, and I walked out into the December light. The December light outside the courthouse was thin and flat, the kind that gives no warmth even when it's direct on your face. Bernard had a car waiting, his own, not a cab, which I appreciated because I did not have the capacity for small talk with a stranger. I got in, and we drove without a destination for a few minutes while he made a call to Patricia, and I watched the city move past the window. Knoxville in December looks the way I feel most of the time lately. Functional, a little worn, carrying the weight of its own history without making much fuss about it. I had lived in this city for 53 years. I had built something here, and raised someone here, and buried the person I loved most here. It was mine in the way a place becomes yours, not through ownership, but through accumulated time. And sitting in that car after the hearing, watching it pass, I felt that ownership in my chest like a physical thing. "The DA's office will be in touch within the week," Bernard said when he got off the phone. He was already in motion. Bernard was always already in motion, which was part of why I'd kept him for 40 years. "They'll want a formal statement from you, more detailed than what you gave today. Dates, sequences, everything you remember about the cabin. We should schedule that as soon as possible while it's sharp." "How serious is it?" I asked. Realistically, Bernard was quiet for a moment in the way he got quiet when he was deciding how direct to be. "The financial piece is serious. The transaction records, the Delaware LLC, the pattern over 3 years, that's not impulsive behavior, Harold. That's a documented scheme. Prosecutors like documented schemes because they tell a clear story to a jury." He paused. "The abandonment piece is potentially more serious. Tennessee law on elder abuse and neglect is not gentle. Leaving a 78-year-old person in an inadequate shelter with insufficient food and no functioning communication in winter conditions. I don't want to overstate where this lands because that's the DA's analysis to make. But I don't think it goes nowhere." I absorbed that. "And the assets?" "The frozen accounts stay frozen until the investigation concludes. What he moved to Nashville, the 460, will be subject to a recovery order. His own assets are likely to be encumbered once the fraud charges are formally filed." He glanced at me. "The short version is that your estate is intact. His isn't." I looked back out the window. A gas station, a hardware store, an old diner I'd eaten breakfast at maybe 200 times over 20 years, back when the business was on the other side of town, and I'd stopped there on the way in. "Where do you want me to take you?" Bernard asked. I had been avoiding the answer to this question for 3 weeks. Bernard's fold-out couch had served its purpose. It was where I needed to be while everything was in motion. But what it had not been was a place to actually live, and I was going to have to actually live somewhere while the legal machinery ground through what came next. The house on Ellsworth Street was available to me now. The protective order had kept it intact. It was mine. It had always been mine. The listing was dead and the locks hadn't been changed. I thought about standing in Margaret's bedroom 3 weeks ago, not letting myself look at her chair or her books or the indentation in the mattress. I thought about the photograph I'd taken and had been carrying since, the one of the two of us at the lake, which I'd looked at every day but still hadn't been able to put down anywhere because putting it down felt like arriving somewhere I wasn't ready to be. "Home," I said. The house felt different than it had on the night I'd gone in for the letter. Part of it was the time of day. It was just past noon, the winter sun at its highest and still not doing much, and the rooms had a gray, even light that made everything look very still and a little fragile. The way things look when they've been left alone long enough to lose the energy of occupation. The heat was low, the air had that specific chill of an unoccupied house in winter, and there was a faint smell of dust that hadn't been there before Margaret died because she had been the one who cared about dust, and I had been the one who was grateful that someone did. I stood in the hallway for a long moment. Then I turned the heat up, hung my coat, and went to the kitchen to make coffee. That was how I came back to my own house after 3 weeks. No ceremony, just coffee. It was the most ordinary thing I knew how to do, and I needed ordinary very badly right then. I called Bernard from the kitchen while the coffee brewed and told him I was fine and to keep me updated. Then I sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Ethan had held my hand and asked me to let him carry things for a while. And I drank my coffee, and I allowed myself for the first time since the cabin to simply be still. The thing about surviving something is that while you're doing it, the surviving takes up all the available space. There is no room for feeling much of anything except the next problem, the next step, the next piece of the thing you need to get through. And then one day the surviving is mostly done, and the space opens back up, and everything that has been waiting in the waiting room of your mind walks through the door at once. My wife was dead. My son had tried to steal everything she and I had built together, and then, when that wasn't moving fast enough, he had driven me to a mountain and left me there. The boy I had taught to ride a bike and driven to college and lent money to twice in his 30s when things were lean and never asked to be paid back. That boy had looked at me and seen an asset to be liquidated. I sat at the kitchen table and felt all of it, finally. Not dramatically, just thoroughly. It moved through me the way weather moves through. You don't stop it, you just let it pass. Then I rinsed my cup, got up, and put the photograph of Margaret and me at the lake on the windowsill over the sink where I could see it. That was day 1. The DA's formal contact came 4 days later, in the form of an investigator named Ray Suggs, mid-40s, patient manner, the kind of person who makes you feel like he has all the time in the world, even when you suspect he doesn't. He came to the house with a colleague and a recording device and a legal pad, and he asked me to start from the beginning and not leave anything out. I talked for 2 hours. He asked questions that were precise and unhurried, the kind that told me he had already done significant background work and was now filling in the spaces he needed filled in. At the end, he thanked me, told me someone would be in touch about next steps, and shook my hand at the door the way people do when they mean it rather than when it's reflexive. "One question," I said before he reached his car. He turned. "Is there anything you can tell me at this point about how he's responding?" Suggs considered this for a moment. "His attorneys have advised him to cooperate," he said. "Whether he takes that advice is an ongoing question." He paused. "Mr. Whitmore, in my experience, and I've worked financial exploitation cases for 12 years, the people who plan something this carefully over this long a period of time usually have convinced themselves it's justified. They have a story they tell themselves about why they're the reasonable one, and everyone else has it wrong." He looked at me steadily. "That story gets very hard to maintain when the documentation is as complete as it is in this case." I nodded. "Thank you." He drove away, and I went back inside. Then, the investigation moved faster than I expected, and in ways I hadn't fully anticipated. Bernard called me 2 weeks after the hearing to tell me that Patricia's analysis had turned up something she hadn't found in the initial review. A third account, this one overseas, registered to a shell company that traced back to the Delaware LLC. The amount in it was smaller than the Nashville account, but the existence of it, Bernard said, was significant from a prosecution standpoint because it demonstrated an intent to move assets beyond easy legal reach. It was, he said, the kind of thing that transformed a complex civil matter into something that federal prosecutors might also find interesting. "Federal," I said. "Potentially. If the wire transfers cross state lines in a pattern that meets the threshold, and Patricia believes they do, we're looking at a wider net than just the state charges." I sat with that. I had not wanted to want this. There was a version of me that would have been satisfied with the hearing, with the estate intact, with Ethan's actions on record. I had told myself I didn't want to be the man consumed by punishment, But somewhere under the part of me that wanted to be generous, there was another part. Older, harder. The part that had counted cans of food in a cold cabin by a wood stove at 2 in the morning. And that part understood something clearly. What Ethan had done was not a private family wound. It was a crime. And crimes have consequences not because the victim demands them, but because the alternative is a world where this kind of thing keeps happening to people who have less than I did. People who don't have a Bernard Caulfield or a Patricia Stern or a Margaret who planned ahead. People who stay on the mountain. Let it go where it goes, I told Bernard. That's what I thought you'd say, he said. What came next arrived not all at once, but in increments, each one landing with a weight that built on the ones before it. The criminal complaint was filed in January. Elder financial abuse, elder neglect, fraud, and 2 counts related to the wire transfers. Ethan was arrested on a Tuesday morning at his Nashville apartment, booked and released on bond the same afternoon. His picture ran in the Knoxville paper the next day, and the Nashville paper the day after that, because the name Whitmore was not unknown in either city, and because the specifics of the case, the mountain cabin, the dead satellite phone, the father who walked into his own estate hearing, were the kind of narrative that moves through a community. Bernard called me when the arrest was made. I was in the kitchen making breakfast, and I sat down at the table and I stayed there for a while after I hung up. I don't know exactly what I felt. Not satisfaction, or not only that, something more complicated and less clean, the way most true things are. I thought about calling Ethan. I picked up the phone twice and put it back down. The truth was, I didn't know what I would say, and I had spent too much of my life saying things I hadn't thought through to the people I loved. So I said nothing. I ate my breakfast. I called Bernard back to make sure the arrest hadn't created any new complications for the estate. It hadn't. The civil side moved on its own track. Ethan's personal assets, his Nashville apartment, 2 investment accounts, a vehicle, were encumbered pending the fraud proceedings. The money from the brokerage liquidations was subject to a recovery order. Most of it was recovered over the following 6 weeks as accounts were unwound and funds traced. The overseas account took longer and required cooperation from Bernard's contacts at an international banking law firm, which Bernard seemed to find interesting in the way attorneys sometimes find complex problems more engaging than simple ones. Eventually, that too was recovered. The cost to Ethan's professional life was something I learned about secondhand through Bernard, who learned about it through the way information moves in a city where people know each other. Ethan had been involved in 2 real estate ventures in Nashville that his partners dissolved following the arrest and the accompanying news coverage. A board position he held with a nonprofit was quietly terminated. People who had known him socially began to know him less. I did not track any of this actively. I heard things when Bernard told me things, and I processed them as data rather than as victories, because I had learned long enough ago to know that treating another person's destruction as a victory is a way of making that destruction the center of your own life, and I was not willing to give it that place. It was Bernard who first raised the question of what I intended to do with the secondary trust. He raised it carefully, the way he raised careful things, over coffee in his office on a Wednesday afternoon in late January, when the criminal proceedings were underway and the civil recovery was mostly complete, and the immediate urgency had finally settled into something more like an ongoing process that didn't require my attention every day. You have $4.2 million in the secondary trust that was never touched, he said, plus the recovered assets, plus what remained in the primary estate that Ethan didn't reach. He looked at me over his coffee cup. You're not a poor man, Harold. What do you want to do with it? I had been thinking about this. I had been thinking about it since the cabin, actually, in the way that extreme situations have of clarifying what matters to you, when all the noise is stripped away and you are down to the essential things. What I had thought about, specifically, was a conversation I'd had once with Margaret about aging, about what it meant to get old in a country that didn't have a good vocabulary for it. She had said, and I remember this precisely, because Margaret said most things precisely. The worst thing isn't the physical decline, Harold. The worst thing is when people stop treating you like you're still in the room. I had thought about Ray Suggs telling me he'd worked financial exploitation cases for 12 years. I had thought about Dr. Foley saying what happened to me was not unusual enough to surprise a physician who dealt with old people every day. I had thought about that young woman with the legal pad in the back of the courtroom, and about the fact that her article had generated, according to Bernard, more reader response than anything the paper had run that month. Because this story, the specific story of an old man left on a mountain by his own son, was not a story that felt distant to the people who read it. It felt familiar. It felt like something that had happened to someone they knew, or to someone they feared they might become, or to a parent they were watching age from a careful distance and not entirely sure how to protect. I want to do something with it, I told Bernard. Not all of it. I'm 78 years old and I don't know how long I need to fund my own life, and I'm not going to be reckless about that. But a meaningful portion. I paused. I want to talk to some people first. Find out what actually exists to help people in the situation I was in. What the gaps are. Bernard nodded slowly. That could take some time to research properly. I know. I set down my cup. I've got time. He looked at me for a moment with the expression he got sometimes. Not quite a smile, but something that lived near one. Yes, he said. You do what you... I moved back into the house on Ellsworth Street properly in February. Properly means I unpacked the things I'd been living without, settled back into the rhythms of the house, and finally, after 4 months of avoiding it, went into Margaret's room and sat in her reading chair and stayed there for an hour. Nothing dramatic. I just sat there. I looked at her books and her lamp and the view of the backyard through the window that she had always said was the best view in the house because you could see the dogwood tree. And I let myself miss her in the direct and undisguised way that I had been managing rather than feeling since the day she died. I cried in that chair. I had cried once before, in the truck coming off the mountain, and that had been for her too. Both times were for her, specifically. Not for what had happened with Ethan, not for the cabin, or the hearing, or any of the machinery of the months in between, but simply for the fact that she was gone, and I was still here, and I was going to have to be still here for whatever time remained without her. That is a specific kind of grief, and it doesn't resolve. You just make room for it. I did not go into the room again for several weeks after that, but I left the door open. In March, I received a letter from Ethan's attorney, not from Ethan directly, which told me everything I needed to know about where his relationship with his own counsel stood. The letter was about the criminal proceeding. Ethan had decided, after consultation, to enter a guilty plea to 2 of the charges in exchange for a negotiated disposition. The federal wire fraud charges were being held in abeyance pending his cooperation with the broader investigation, which had apparently branched in a direction I hadn't been tracking. Something about the shell company having been used for transactions beyond those related to my estate. Bernard explained it without elaborating too much, because the details were no longer really my matter. The state charges carried a mandatory restitution order. The recovered assets were formally returned to my estate, and a period of supervised release with conditions that included no contact with me. Ethan did not serve jail time, which I had been told in advance was the likely outcome given his lack of prior record and the plea arrangement. I had been asked through Bernard whether I had any statement I wished to make at the sentencing. I thought about it for several days. In the end, I wrote 3 sentences. Bernard delivered them. What was done to me was not done in a moment of desperation or poor judgment. It was planned over years. I asked the court to take that into account in determining what accountability looks like here. Not for my satisfaction, but because accountability is the only thing that makes any of this mean something beyond my own particular situation. The judge, who was not Judge Hargrove but a different judge in a different court, read my statement into the record and cited it directly in her sentencing remarks. Bernard said that was unusual. I said I was glad. I was not in the courtroom for the sentencing. I had been there for the part that was mine to be present for. This part belonged to the system I had trusted and which had, imperfectly and slowly and at considerable cost, done what systems are supposed to do. I stayed home. I made coffee. I sat at the kitchen table and looked at the photograph on the windowsill. Bernard called me when it was done. "It's over," he said. "Yes," I said. But that wasn't quite right. Nothing that size is simply over. What it was, more accurately, was finished, which is different. Over implies disappearance. Finished means the active part has ended, and what remains is yours to carry or set down as you see fit. I had not yet decided which parts I was going to set down and which parts I was going to carry. I suspected that was not a decision you made once, but rather something you negotiated with yourself over time. On the ordinary days when nothing important was happening and you were just a person in a kitchen in the house you'd lived in for 30 years, figuring out what came next. The dogwood in the backyard was starting to show the first suggestions of buds. It was still March, too early for anything to actually open, but the suggestion was there, the faint thickening of the bare branches that meant something was deciding to come back despite the cold. Margaret had planted that tree in 1994. She had picked the spot herself, that window in the bedroom, this view from the kitchen. She had known where she wanted to see it from, and she had planted it accordingly. I stood at the kitchen window for a while and looked at it. Then I picked up the phone and called Bernard back. "Get me a meeting with someone from the area agency on aging," I said, "and see if you can find me a contact at whatever organization does the most work on elder financial exploitation in this state. I want to understand the landscape before I decide anything." A pause on the other end. "You're serious about this?" "Bernard," I said, "I've been serious about it since the cabin. The woman from the Area Agency on Aging was named Gloria Tran, and she arrived at Bernard's office on a Thursday morning in late March carrying a canvas tote bag and the particular manner of someone who has spent 20 years doing important work that most people don't know exists. She was in her early 50s, practical in the way people who do social services work become practical. Not hard, but without excess. She shook my hand, sat down across from me, accepted coffee from Darlene, and looked at me with the direct attention of someone who was genuinely trying to understand what I was offering before she said anything about what she needed. "Bernard told me a little about your situation," she said. "I'd rather hear it from you." So I told her. The condensed version. Not the way I've told it to you, with all the interior texture of it, but the factual sequence. Margaret's death, the signing, the cabin, the hearing, what came after. I watched her face while I talked. She did not perform sympathy, which I appreciated. She listened the way a physician listens when they're building a picture. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "How many people do you think are in situations like the one you were in without the resources you had?" "That's what I'm trying to understand," I said. She set down her coffee cup. "In Tennessee alone, we estimate tens of thousands of older adults experience some form of financial exploitation every year. Most of it is family. Most of it is never reported. Most of it is never prosecuted." She paused. "The number who have a Bernard Caulfield and a Patricia Stern and a secondary trust that a very wise wife arranged without telling them." She left that sentence where it was. I understood what she was leaving unsaid. "What do you need that you don't have?" She looked at me steadily. "Legal assistance for people who can't afford it. Emergency housing for people who've been displaced, whose homes have been sold out from under them, or who've been removed from their homes and have nowhere to go. Documentation support. Someone in the room with them when family members come back with new paperwork and new stories." She picked up her coffee again. "What we mostly have is not enough of anything." I went home that afternoon and sat at the kitchen table for a long time. Then I called Bernard and told him to start the paperwork for a charitable foundation. It took longer than I expected. Everything that matters takes longer than you expect. That is one of the true things I know after 78 years, and I have stopped being surprised by it even when I'm frustrated by it. The foundation required its own legal structure, its own board, its own governance documentation. Bernard found a nonprofit attorney he trusted, a woman named Cecile Park, who wore interesting earrings and asked very good questions, and she and Bernard and I spent 6 weeks getting the architecture right. I named it the Margaret Whitmore Foundation, not the Harold Whitmore Foundation, not the Whitmore Family Foundation. Hers. Because the foundation existed because of what she had seen coming and what she had quietly done about it, and because the least I could do was make sure her name was on the thing she had, in a sense, built. Bernard raised an eyebrow when I told him the name. Not disagreement, just the mild professional instinct that foundations named after individuals sometimes create complications with legacy governance. I told him it wasn't open for discussion. He wrote it down. The initial endowment was $1.8 million from the secondary trust, enough to establish meaningful operations without depleting my own ability to fund the rest of whatever my life contained. Cecile advised me on the structure of the disbursement schedule, and what we arrived at was a three-part program. Legal aid partnerships with two existing organizations that worked elder law cases for low-income clients. A small emergency housing fund specifically for adults over 65 who had been displaced through family financial abuse, and what Gloria called a navigation program, meaning someone, a real human being with actual expertise, who could sit down with an older adult and help them understand what documents they were being asked to sign, what the consequences were, and what their rights were before they signed anything. That last one was the one I felt most deeply. If there had been a person like that at my kitchen table in the weeks after Margaret's funeral, not a lawyer, not a formal proceeding, just someone who could have said quietly, "Mr. Whitmore, do you understand what this document transfers and whether you actually want to transfer it right now, 3 months after your wife died?" The whole machinery of what followed might never have been necessary. Gloria came on as the Foundation's first executive director. I had not planned to offer her the position. I had imagined she would be an advisor, a resource. But 3 conversations in, it became clear that she understood the landscape of what we were trying to do better than anyone I'd spoken to, and that she was currently doing that work inside a system that didn't give her enough to do it with. I asked her directly, without preamble, whether she would consider leaving her current position to run this one. She was quiet for a long moment. "You'd give me operational autonomy?" "You know this work and I don't," I said. "What I have is money and experience running an organization. The first one I'm giving you, the second one I'll make available if you want it. What I won't do is run your organization for you." She looked at me with that direct attention of hers. "Okay," she said. "Yes." That was April. By June, the Foundation had its first 3 legal aid partnerships active. The Housing Fund had provided emergency assistance to 7 individuals, and the Navigation Program had its first 2 trained navigators working with referrals from social services agencies in Knox and surrounding counties. None of it was large. None of it was clean. There were problems constantly. A partner organization that turned out to have internal governance issues that complicated the relationship, a housing fund disbursement that fell through a gap in the criteria we'd written and left someone without support for 2 weeks longer than was acceptable, a navigator who was excellent at the work but struggled with the documentation requirements and needed more administrative backup than we'd budgeted for. Gloria called me about each of these things, not because she needed me to solve them, but because she was, as I came to understand, someone who believed that the person funding an operation should know when things weren't working as intended. I appreciated that. It was how I had always wanted to run a business, and rarely found people willing to do it with me. Somewhere in the middle of all of this, late May, the dogwood in the backyard fully open now, that particular white that Margaret had specifically chosen over the pink variety because she said it was cleaner, I heard from Ethan. Not directly. Through his attorney, who sent Bernard a letter requesting that I consider a meeting. The letter was careful and formal, and said very little beyond the request itself, which I understood was intentional. His attorney was not going to put anything in writing that could be construed as an admission or a negotiation. I sat with the request for a week. I want to be honest with you about what that week felt like, because I think the honest version is important, and the clean version would be a lie. The honest version is that I went back and forth more times than I would have predicted. There was a part of me, the part that had taught him to ride a bike, the part that had driven to collect him from college at 2 a.m, the part that had sat beside Margaret's hospital bed thinking about the years and what they had contained, that wanted to see my son, that wanted there to be something salvageable in the space between us. Not what it had been, because what it had been was built on a foundation that had always been cracked, and I just couldn't see the cracks clearly enough, but something. And there was another part, the part that had counted cans of food in a cold cabin, the part that had lain awake on that cot on the 4th night doing the math on the firewood, that was not ready, that might never be ready, that looked at the letter and felt underneath everything else a very old and very quiet anger that had nowhere useful to go, but that was not finished existing yet. I talked to Bernard about it. I talked to Gloria about it, which surprised me. She was not a person I'd expected to become someone I talked to about things that weren't related to the foundation, but she had a way of listening that made you want to continue. And I talked to Dr. Foley, who I'd started seeing as an actual physician rather than just for documentation purposes, Because she was good and because I needed a doctor and because I was 78 years old and the cabin had not been gentle on my body. None of them told me what to do. That was the right call. It was my decision to make, and it could only be mine. In the end, I told Bernard to respond that I was not ready for a meeting and did not know if I would be, and that if Ethan wanted to communicate something specific, he was welcome to write me a letter directly. Not through attorneys, not managed and lawyered. A letter. I don't know if he will. As I tell you this, I don't know. He has not written yet. Maybe he won't. Maybe he will write something that sounds like the phone call from December, arranged and practiced, the version of himself he manages for external consumption. Maybe he will write something true. I can't know in advance which it will be, and I have stopped trying to predict my son, which is a sentence I never thought I would say in my life, and which costs me something every time I think it. What I know is this: forgiveness is not a door you walk through once and find yourself on the other side of. It is more like a condition you move toward in increments, and the increments are not regular, and the movement is not always forward. I am moving. I am not there. I may not be there for a long time, and I have made my peace with that being true, because making peace with difficult truths is the work of living, and I intend to keep living. The Foundation's first public event was a small community information session held at the Knox County Public Library on a Thursday evening in July. Gloria organized it, a 2-hour session on elder financial rights, with 3 of our legal aid partners presenting and a navigator available afterward for individual conversations. We had expected 30 people. 64 came. I was not scheduled to speak. I had specifically told Gloria I didn't want to be the centerpiece of the thing. That would have made it about me and about my story, and what I wanted it to be about was the work and the people the work was for. But at the end of the session, during the question period, an older man in the 3rd row raised his hand and asked, in a voice that was trying to be steady and not quite managing it, whether there was any help available for someone whose family had already taken most of what he had, and who didn't know how to begin fighting it. The room went very quiet. Gloria answered him, clearly, specifically, walking him through exactly what resources existed and what the first step was. She was good at it. She was very good at it, and I watched her, and I thought about what it must mean to that man to hear a specific answer to a question he had probably been afraid to ask out loud for months. Afterward, when most people had left and the library staff were folding up chairs, that man came and found me. I don't know how he knew who I was. Perhaps Gloria had mentioned it, or perhaps people who are in desperate situations develop a sense for who in a room might understand them. He was in his early 70s. He had the look of someone who had been carrying something very heavy for a long time without putting it down. He shook my hand and didn't say much, just that his daughter had been handling his finances since his wife got sick, and that by the time he realized what was happening, he didn't know who to trust or how to start. "You start with Gloria," I told him. "First thing tomorrow. She'll tell you exactly what to do." He nodded. He didn't let go of my hand right away. "Is it?" He stopped, started again. "Does it get better?" I looked at him. I thought about the cabin and the courtroom and the kitchen table and the letter in my shirt pocket and the dogwood Margaret planted in 1994. I thought about all the ways in which the answer to his question was complicated and imperfect and not the clean reassurance he was hoping for. "It gets different," I said. "Different is not the same as better, but it's something you can work with." He nodded slowly. He let go of my hand. He went to find Gloria. I stood in the emptying library and watched him go, and I felt something that I don't have a precise word for. Not happiness, and not peace exactly, and not the satisfaction of a problem solved. Something more like the feeling of standing in the right place at the right time for a reason that is yours specifically, a reason built from the particular wreckage of your particular life. The feeling of something that was meant to destroy you becoming instead the thing that shows you what you're actually for. It is late September now as I finish telling you this story, and the dogwood in the backyard has gone to its fall color, that deep, complicated red that Margaret always said was even better than the spring white, because you had to wait for it, and it didn't last long, and when it was there, you knew it. I am 78 years old. My knees still hurt in the morning. My back is a negotiation every day. I have a physician I trust, and a foundation that is doing real work, and an attorney who has been my attorney for 40 years and has not once, in all of that time, been wrong about something that mattered. I have a photograph on the kitchen windowsill and a letter I have memorized, and a reading chair in a room whose door I can now keep open. I do not have my son, not in the way I used to have him, not in any way I currently recognize. The no-contact order from his sentencing has months remaining. After that, I don't know. I cannot plan for a relationship I can't yet see the shape of. What I can do is stay open to the possibility that people are more than the worst thing they've done, while also being clear-eyed about what the worst thing was and what it cost. Both of those things can be true at the same time. Margaret told me so, and she was right about most things. What I want to say to you, and I mean you specifically, whoever you are listening to this, wherever you are, is something I wish someone had said to me 40 years ago, before any of this, when I was still young enough to think that loving people hard enough was a substitute for seeing them clearly. Love is not enough. I know that sounds like the opposite of what you're supposed to believe, the opposite of everything we're told about what holds a life together. But love without clear eyes is just vulnerability dressed up as devotion. You can love your children, your parents, your partners, with everything you have, and still owe it to yourself to see them as they actually are, rather than as you need them to be. That distinction between the person you love and the person you're telling yourself you love is one of the hardest things a human being can hold on to. But it is the thing that protects you. It is the thing my wife held on to when I couldn't, and it is the reason I am here to tell you any of this. The second thing I want to say is about age, because I have earned the right to say it. Getting old in this country means being treated, by degrees, as though you are becoming less of a person, less capable of decisions, less entitled to dignity, less worth listening to. I felt that in the way Ethan spoke to me in the months after Margaret's death. I felt it in the documents he put in front of me at that kitchen table. I feel it sometimes in stores and in doctors' offices, and in the particular patience people deploy when they speak to me now, the kind of patience that is really a form of condescension in soft clothing. Your age does not reduce you. Your grief does not make you incompetent. Your loneliness does not obligate you to accept whatever someone offers in place of genuine love. You have the right to your own money, your own mind, your own choices, your own life, for as long as you are living it. If someone is trying to take those things from you, or pressuring you to sign things you don't fully understand, or isolating you from people who might ask inconvenient questions, that is not love. That is not care. That is someone who has decided your life is a resource and they are entitled to it. You are not a resource. You are a person. Act accordingly. The third thing, and this is the one that costs me the most to say, because I am not a man who has ever found it easy to admit that I needed help, is that I should have asked for help sooner. Not with the legal situation, which I could not have anticipated, but with the grief, with the isolation, with the fog that descended after Margaret died, and that made it possible for my son to walk up to me with a stack of documents and find me in exactly the condition he needed me to be in. I should have talked to someone. I should have let someone in. I had spent 44 years with a woman who was, among many other things, the person who kept me honest with myself. And when she died, I lost that function along with everything else she was. And I did not find a replacement for it, and I paid for that. This is not self-blame. I want to be clear about that distinction, because they are easy to confuse. What happened to me was done to me by someone who chose to do it. But the isolation that made me vulnerable, that was something I could have addressed and didn't, because men of my generation were not taught to address it. We were taught to carry our weight alone and call that strength. It is not strength. It is just a different kind of vulnerability, one that doesn't announce itself until someone finds it and uses it. Find your people. Keep them close. Let them ask you questions you don't want to answer. That is not weakness. That is the maintenance work of being a person in the world. Gloria called me last week to tell me that the navigation program had just completed its 100th individual consultation since June. 100 people who had sat down with one of our navigators before signing something, before making a financial decision under pressure, before handing control of their lives to someone they weren't sure they could trust. I don't know how many of those 100 will avoid what happened to me. I don't know how many were on the edge of something terrible and are now, because of one conversation, on a slightly different path. but 100 since June, with 2 navigators. I told Gloria to start the process of hiring a third. There is a thing that happens when you build something, a company, a foundation, a life, that no one tells you about in advance, which is that the building itself is the point. Not the finished product, because there is no finished product, because everything is always in the middle of becoming something. The point is the daily work of it, the problems you solve, and the problems that defeat you, and the mornings you get up and try again anyway, not because you're certain it will work, but because the alternative is to stop. And stopping is a kind of dying that happens before you're dead. I am not done. That is what I want you to understand about where I am right now, at 78, with everything that has happened in the past year. I am not in the epilogue of my own story. I am in the middle of it, with all the mess and uncertainty that implies. My knees hurt and my son is somewhere I can't reach, and my wife is gone, and the organization I'm building is imperfect and will require more than I have some days, and I'm going to keep going anyway. Because Margaret planted a dogwood tree in 1994 in a spot where she could see it from the bedroom and from the kitchen, and it has come back every spring since then without being asked. And it came back this spring while I was in the middle of everything, and it is going to come back next spring regardless of what I do or don't do. And there is something in that, in the bare, stubborn fact of things that keep coming back, that I find more sustaining than anything else I know. I go out and sit near it some evenings, when the weather allows. I bring my coffee, and I sit in the yard and I look at it, and I think about the woman who chose it and placed it and tended it for 30 years. And I think about the old man in the library who needed to know it gets different. And I think about the 100 people who sat down with a navigator and maybe changed the direction of something. And I think, this is enough. Not everything. Not what I wanted. Not what I planned. But enough to keep going, enough to matter, enough to get up again tomorrow. That will do. That will do just fine.